1 year after their wedding, Lena Whitmore and Ethan Whitmore lived a life that looked ordinary from the outside. They occupied a modest two-bedroom house on a quiet street, paid their bills on time, and appeared in family photos with calm, polite smiles. There were no police visits, no neighbors calling in complaints, no visible signs of chaos. To anyone passing by, they were simply another married couple settling into adulthood. But inside that house, something had begun to rot, slowly, quietly, and invisibly. Lena was 34, thoughtful by nature, the kind of woman who paid attention to tone and silence more than words themselves. She worked steadily, took pride in keeping their home clean, and believed deeply in the idea that marriage was something you protected, even when it became difficult. Ethan, 3 years older, had always been confident, outspoken, and blunt. During their years of dating, that bluntness had felt like honesty. After marriage, it began to feel different. The change did not arrive all at once. It crept in. In the first months, Ethan grew distant in ways that were easy to excuse. He came home tired. He brushed off affection with a distracted shrug. When Lena asked if something was wrong, he answered quickly, almost too quickly, "I'm fine." She told herself this was normal. People said the first year of marriage tested couples. She believed them. Then came the comments. At first, they were small, almost casual. Ethan would wrinkle his nose slightly when she leaned in close. He would open a window after she left a room. Once, when she asked if he wanted to sit beside her on the couch, he said, "Maybe later," without looking up. Lena noticed these moments, felt them lodge in her chest, but she didn't yet have words for her discomfort. She tried harder. She bought new soaps, switched detergents, washed their sheets more often. She showered twice a day without being asked. Still, Ethan pulled away. Still, the air between them felt heavy with something unspoken. The first time she heard what he was saying to others was by accident. Lena had gone to the grocery store late one evening. When she realized she had forgotten her phone, she turned back, entering through the side door. From the kitchen, she heard Ethan's voice drifting in from the living room, relaxed, almost amused. He was on the phone with someone she recognized as his friend Mark. "I don't know how to say this without sounding like a jerk," Ethan said, laughing softly. "But sometimes it's just unpleasant being close to her." Lena froze. There was a pause, then Ethan continued, his tone matter-of-fact. "Yeah. I mean, I love her, but it's real. It's like this smell that never goes away." Lena did not hear Mark's response. She did not need to. Her hands shook as she backed out of the house, returning to the car without her phone, without breathing properly, without understanding how the ground beneath her had shifted so suddenly. That night, Ethan said nothing to her. Neither did she. She lay awake beside him, staring at the ceiling, her mind replaying his words over and over. Unpleasant. Smell. Never goes away. The next morning, she stood in front of the bathroom mirror for a long time. She examined her face, her skin, her hair. She leaned closer to herself, sniffing her own wrist, her neck, her clothes. Everything seemed normal. Still, doubt had already taken root. Over the following weeks, Lena began to sense the ripple effect of Ethan's words. Conversations with friends felt strained. Invitations slowed. A coworker asked her gently if she was feeling okay, if everything at home was comfortable. The question lingered in the air, heavy with implication. When Lena finally confronted Ethan, her voice barely held steady. "Did you tell people something about me?" she asked. Ethan looked surprised, not guilty, not defensive. Just surprised that she knew. "I didn't lie," he said. "I was venting. Everyone does that." "About something like that?" she asked. "About your wife?" He sighed, rubbing his face. "You're overreacting. It's not like I said it to hurt you." But it did hurt her. Deeply. Permanently. From that point on, the balance between them shifted. Lena became hyper-aware of herself, of how she moved through rooms, how close she stood to others. She avoided hugging friends. She pulled back from social gatherings. Inside her own home, she no longer felt safe from judgment. Ethan, meanwhile, grew more careless with his words. What had once been said in private became something he referenced openly, sometimes with a sarcastic edge, sometimes with irritation. "You know why I don't want to talk about this," he said during one argument. "It's awkward." Awkward. As if her existence had become an inconvenience. Lena began to schedule medical appointments, convinced something must be wrong with her. Tests came back normal. Doctors reassured her gently. Nothing was physically wrong. Each confirmation should have comforted her. Instead, it made her confusion worse. If nothing was wrong, why did her husband speak about her that way? At night, she cried silently so Ethan wouldn't hear. During the day, she forced herself to smile, to work, to function. She believed, desperately, that if she could just fix whatever Ethan claimed was broken, their marriage could be saved. But the problem was never her body. It was the way Ethan's words followed her everywhere, into her thoughts, her dreams, her sense of self. With every repetition, they stripped away a little more of her dignity, her confidence, her belief that she deserved kindness. By the end of that first year, the marriage was no longer a partnership. It was a quiet battlefield, and Lena was fighting a war no one else could see. She did not yet know where it would lead. She only knew that something inside her was breaking, and that it was breaking slowly, under the weight of words that refused to disappear. What began as whispered comments and careless remarks did not stay contained for long. Once Ethan Whitmore crossed the line of speaking about his wife to others, he seemed unable, or unwilling, to step back. The words gained a life of their own, moving freely beyond the walls of their home, reshaping how others saw Lena and how she saw herself. At first, the humiliation was indirect. Lena noticed pauses in conversations when she entered a room. She felt eyes linger on her, then quickly look away. Friends who once hugged her warmly now kept a careful distance, as if closeness itself required caution. No one said anything openly, but silence has a language of its own, and Lena was becoming fluent in it. Ethan, meanwhile, behaved as though nothing had changed. He laughed easily. He spoke freely. When he gathered with friends, his tone carried an ease that suggested he felt justified, almost relieved, to have finally voiced what he believed. What he did not see, or chose not to see, was how each word he shared stripped another layer from his wife's dignity. One evening, Ethan hosted a small get-together at their house. It was nothing unusual, just a few friends, drinks on the kitchen counter, casual conversation drifting between work and weekend plans. Lena stayed mostly quiet, seated at the far end of the table, answering when spoken to, smiling when expected. She could feel the tension humming beneath the surface, like a wire stretched too tight. At one point, Mark Delaney joked about marriage being a test of patience. Ethan laughed louder than anyone else. "Tell me about it," he said, shaking his head. "Some things you don't really find out until after the wedding." There was a pause. Mark raised an eyebrow. Someone chuckled nervously. Ethan continued, unaware, or uncaring, of Lena's stillness. "I mean, love's great and all, but when you're living with someone every day, certain issues don't stay hidden." Lena's chest tightened. She did not look at him. She did not need to. She could hear it coming, the familiar shape of the humiliation forming in his voice. Rachel Moore, their neighbor, later recalled the moment clearly. It wasn't what he said exactly, she explained to detectives months later. It was how comfortable he was saying it. Like it was normal. Like she wasn't even there. Lena excused herself and went into the bathroom. She locked the door, leaned over the sink, and stared at her reflection. Her face looked pale, distant, like someone she barely recognized. She turned on the faucet, letting the sound of running water drown out the laughter from the other room. Her hands trembled as she pressed them against the counter, grounding herself in something solid. When she returned, the conversation had moved on. No one mentioned what had been said. No one apologized. The silence was its own form of agreement. After that night, the comments grew bolder. Ethan no longer framed them as complaints. He framed them as facts. At a bar with coworkers, he said, "I sleep on the couch most nights. It's easier." When asked why, he shrugged. Some things are hard to ignore. Word traveled faster than Lena could outrun it. People she barely knew now carried opinions about her body, her cleanliness, her worth as a wife, opinions shaped entirely by her husband's voice. She felt exposed in a way she could not explain, as though her most private self had been placed on display without her consent. Lena tried to confront him again. "Why would you tell people that?" she asked one night, her voice shaking despite her efforts to stay calm. "Do you have any idea what it does to me?" Ethan leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "I'm not lying. I'm allowed to talk to my friends." "About humiliating me?" she asked. He exhaled sharply. "You're making it into something it's not." But it was something. It was everything. Lena stopped attending social gatherings. She avoided the grocery store at peak hours. She began taking different routes to work, convinced that strangers were judging her, whispering about her. Even at home, she moved carefully, apologetically, as if she were a guest who had overstayed her welcome. Ethan noticed the change, but he interpreted it as distance, not damage. "You're always so withdrawn," he told her once. "It's exhausting." Exhausting. As if her suffering were an inconvenience. Behind closed doors, his tone sharpened. When arguments broke out, he weaponized the same words he shared publicly. "You know this wouldn't be an issue if you took better care of yourself," he said during one heated exchange. "I am taking care of myself," Lena replied, her voice breaking. "I've done everything." "Then why hasn't anything changed?" he asked. There was no answer that could satisfy him, because the problem was never something she could fix. Lena began to feel as though she were shrinking, her identity reduced to a single cruel narrative. She was no longer seen as a person with thoughts, feelings, and a history. She was a punchline. A problem. Something discussed rather than respected. Rachel noticed Lena standing alone in the driveway one afternoon, staring at the ground. She looked lost, Rachel later said. Like she was waiting for permission to exist. The humiliation had become complete, not just spoken aloud, but absorbed, internalized, and normalized by those around her. And with each passing day, the space where Lena once felt human grew smaller. By the time she realized how deeply the damage had set in, it was already part of her. The words followed her everywhere. They echoed in her head when she woke up, when she showered, when she lay awake at night beside a man who had turned her vulnerability into public property. What Ethan never understood was that humiliation does not fade when the conversation ends. It settles. It festers. And it changes the person who carries it. By the end of that second year, Lena was no longer just living with shame. She was living inside it. By the time the humiliation became public, the damage had already moved inward. What others saw as awkward silence or emotional distance was, for Lena Whitmore, the slow collapse of her inner world. Shame no longer arrived as a reaction, it lived with her, shaping her thoughts, her movements, and her sense of reality. She began to doubt herself in ways she never had before. Every morning started the same way. Lena would wake before Ethan, slip quietly out of bed, and stand in the bathroom for long stretches of time. She examined herself with clinical intensity, as if she were both patient and judge. She smelled her skin, her hair, her clothes. She scrubbed harder than necessary in the shower, until her skin burned slightly beneath the water. She brushed her teeth longer. She reapplied deodorant twice. Sometimes 3 times. Still, the doubt remained. When she stepped out of the bathroom, Ethan barely looked at her. His indifference felt louder than words. It confirmed what she feared, that no amount of effort would ever be enough. Lena scheduled doctor appointments in secret at first. She told herself it was practical, responsible. If something truly was wrong, she needed to know. She described her concerns carefully, embarrassed even as she spoke them aloud. "I'm worried there's something wrong with me," she told her physician, her voice barely above a whisper. The tests came back normal. Every single one. Her doctor reassured her kindly. There was no infection. No medical condition. No cause for concern. Lena nodded and thanked her, but the relief she expected never came. Instead, confusion tightened its grip. If nothing was wrong, then why did Ethan speak about her with such certainty? The answer terrified her. It meant the problem was not her body. It meant the problem was how she was being seen. At home, Ethan's patience wore thinner. He grew irritated by Lena's quietness, by her careful movements, by the way she seemed to disappear into herself. "You don't talk anymore," he said one night. "You're always tense. It's like living with a ghost." She wanted to scream that he was the reason. She wanted to tell him that his words echoed in her mind long after he spoke them. But every time she tried to explain, her voice failed her. "I'm just tired," she said instead. Ethan scoffed. "From what?" "From surviving you," she thought, but she did not say it. The emotional distance between them became absolute. They no longer shared meals. They no longer shared a bed. When they did speak, it was clipped and transactional, stripped of warmth or curiosity. The home that once felt neutral now felt hostile, every room saturated with tension. And still, the comments continued. Sometimes they came casually, tossed out like observations. "You know why I don't touch you," Ethan said once, without looking up from his phone. Other times, they came sharpened with frustration. "I can't pretend it doesn't bother me," he snapped during an argument. "I shouldn't have to." Each statement landed like a blow. Lena stopped arguing back. She learned that defending herself only invited more cruelty. Silence became her shield, though it offered little protection. At night, she lay awake replaying conversations, dissecting every word she had spoken, every moment she might have done something wrong. Her thoughts spiraled uncontrollably. What if he's right? What if everyone else notices too? What if this is who I am now? Sleep became fragmented. When she did manage to rest, her dreams were filled with scenes of exposure, rooms full of people staring at her, whispering, recoiling. She woke with her heart racing, her chest tight, her mouth dry with panic. During the day, she moved through life on autopilot. At work, she struggled to concentrate. Simple tasks felt overwhelming. Her coworkers noticed her distraction, her withdrawn demeanor, but no one pressed too hard. Lena smiled politely and insisted she was fine. She wasn't. Her self-esteem eroded completely. She stopped wearing clothes she once liked, choosing loose, shapeless outfits instead. She avoided mirrors. She avoided eye contact. She avoided herself. The woman she used to be, confident, thoughtful, present, felt distant, almost fictional. Ethan noticed her unraveling, but he framed it as weakness. "You're being dramatic," he said after she broke down crying one evening. "People deal with worse things than this." Worse things. As if the systematic destruction of her identity were insignificant. What Ethan never acknowledged was that his words were not isolated incidents. They formed a pattern, consistent, repetitive, inescapable. Every comment reinforced the same message, that Lena was flawed, undesirable, and unworthy of respect. Over time, that message became internalized. Lena began to speak to herself the way Ethan spoke about her. She criticized her reflection. She apologized unnecessarily. She hesitated before entering rooms, before speaking, before existing. The boundary between Ethan's voice and her own thoughts blurred until she could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. This was no longer humiliation. This was psychological erosion. Rachel Moore later described seeing Lena one afternoon sitting alone on the front steps, her head in her hands. "She looked exhausted," Rachel said. "Not tired, empty." Inside Lena's mind, the world had narrowed to a single unbearable question: how do I make this stop? She tried to leave once. Packed a small bag. Stood at the door with her keys in her hand. But fear held her in place. Fear of judgment. Fear of being alone. Fear that Ethan was right, that no one else would want her either. So she stayed. And with each passing day, the pressure inside her built. There was no release, no validation, no escape. Only repetition. Only endurance. The human mind can tolerate suffering for a time. It adapts. It rationalizes. It waits for relief. But when suffering becomes constant, when there is no safe space, no moment of dignity, the mind begins to fracture. Lena did not become violent overnight. She did not become angry in a sudden burst. She became numb. Her emotions dulled. Her reactions slowed. She felt disconnected from her own body, as if she were observing her life from a distance. This dissociation frightened her more than the pain ever had. It felt like losing control, like fading away while still breathing. By the end of that period, Lena was no longer asking for understanding. She was no longer asking for kindness. She was simply trying to survive. And what neither she nor Ethan understood yet was this: when a person is pushed beyond the limits of endurance, the breaking point does not announce itself loudly. It arrives quietly, in silence, in stillness, in the moment when the mind decides it can no longer carry the weight. That moment was approaching. By the time Lena Whitmore's inner world had begun to fracture, her outer world was already shrinking. The psychological damage she carried did not remain confined to her thoughts, it reshaped her daily life, cutting her off from people, places, and routines that once grounded her. Isolation was no longer something imposed on her. It became something she enforced upon herself, because it felt safer than being seen. She stopped answering phone calls. At first, she let them ring because she was tired. Later, she let them ring because she didn't know what she would say. Conversations required energy she no longer had. They required explanations. They required pretending. Silence, by contrast, asked nothing of her. Friends noticed her absence. Invitations came less frequently, then not at all. A few messages arrived, just checking in, hope you're okay, but Lena rarely responded. She told herself she would answer later, when she felt stronger. That moment never came. At work, the change became impossible to ignore. Lena's performance declined. She stared at her computer screen without absorbing what she read. She missed deadlines. She forgot meetings. Eventually, her supervisor pulled her aside. "You don't seem like yourself," he said carefully. "If something's going on, we can talk about options." Lena nodded, forcing a smile. She thanked him for his concern and went back to her desk. The next week, she requested a leave of absence. She framed it as exhaustion, stress, burnout. No one questioned it. From the outside, it made sense. From the inside, it felt like disappearing. Days blurred together. Without work to structure her time, Lena drifted through the house aimlessly. She cleaned obsessively, scrubbing surfaces that were already spotless. She reorganized drawers that did not need organizing. Physical order felt like the only thing she could still control. Ethan noticed her being home more often. Instead of concern, it irritated him. "So now you're just here all day?" he asked one afternoon. "That's great." She did not answer. The house grew quieter, heavier. They moved around each other like strangers sharing a space neither truly occupied. Meals were eaten separately. Conversations, when they happened at all, were brief and edged with resentment. Ethan began staying out later. When he came home smelling of alcohol, his mood unpredictable, Lena tensed instinctively, not because she feared physical violence, but because she knew his words would be sharper. Alcohol loosened whatever restraint he had left. "You know, people ask me about you," he said one night, slumping into a chair. "They wonder what's wrong." "What do you tell them?" Lena asked, her voice barely audible. Ethan smirked. What do you think? The implication was enough. Lena retreated to the bedroom, closing the door softly behind her, as if noise itself might provoke him further. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring at her hands, willing herself not to cry. Tears felt useless now. They changed nothing. Rachel Moore saw Lena less and less. When she did catch glimpses of her through the window or in the yard, Lena looked diminished, her posture slouched, her gaze fixed on the ground. One afternoon, Rachel tried to start a conversation. Hey, Lena, she called gently. Haven't seen you around much. Lena forced a polite nod. I've just been tired. Rachel hesitated. If you ever need anything. I'm fine, Lena said quickly, the words automatic. She turned away before Rachel could respond. Fine had become her default answer. It required no explanation. It kept people at a distance. Inside, she felt anything but fine. The isolation intensified her thoughts. Without distractions, her mind replayed every insult, every dismissive glance, every public humiliation. The narrative Ethan had created about her now felt inescapable. It shaped how she believed others saw her, even when no one was around. She began to believe she was a burden. That her presence made people uncomfortable. That her absence was a kindness. At night, the house felt especially oppressive. The silence pressed in on her chest, making it difficult to breathe. She lay awake listening to Ethan move around in the other room, each sound a reminder that she was trapped in the same space as the person who had dismantled her sense of self. She considered leaving again. This time, the thought was quieter, heavier. She imagined packing her belongings, driving away, starting over somewhere no one knew her. But the idea felt impossible. She had no energy. No confidence. No belief that escape would actually bring relief. What if the humiliation followed her? What if Ethan was right? What if this was all she deserved? These thoughts did not feel dramatic or emotional. They felt factual. Unquestionable. Ethan, meanwhile, grew increasingly frustrated with her withdrawal. You don't talk, you don't go anywhere, you don't do anything, he snapped during one argument. It's depressing. Depressing. As if her despair were another flaw to be criticized. I can't live like this, he added. Lena stared at him, the irony almost unbearable. Neither can I, she thought, but the words stayed trapped inside her. The desperation crept in slowly. It did not announce itself as panic or hysteria. It arrived as a steady, suffocating weight. Lena felt as though she were sinking, inch by inch, into something she could not climb out of. She stopped imagining a future. The concept felt abstract, irrelevant. Days became something to endure rather than live. She measured time in hours until night, nights until morning. Food lost its taste. Music felt hollow. Even memories, once a source of comfort, now felt painful reminders of who she used to be. One evening, Lena sat alone in the living room while Ethan was out. The house was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. She stared at the wall for a long time, her thoughts drifting into unfamiliar territory. What if this never ends? What if the only way out is to make it stop, completely? The thought frightened her, but it also brought a strange sense of calm. For the first time in months, she felt a flicker of control. The idea was not fully formed. It did not yet have shape or intention. It was simply the recognition that something had to change, because she could not continue like this. When Ethan returned that night, loud and irritated, Lena felt something inside her shift. Not anger. Not fear. Something colder. Something resolved. She watched him from a distance, her emotions dulled, her body heavy but her mind eerily clear. The desperation that had once consumed her was transforming into something else, something dangerous in its quietness. Isolation had stripped Lena of support. Desperation had stripped her of hope. All that remained was endurance, and the growing certainty that endurance had its limits. She was approaching hers. The night before everything ended did not announce itself with chaos. There were no shattered plates, no screaming neighbors, no dramatic threats hurled across the room. It arrived quietly, like so many nights before it, heavy with tension, saturated with things left unsaid. Lena Whitmore spent that afternoon moving through the house with mechanical precision. She folded laundry that did not need folding. She wiped down counters already clean. Each small task gave her hands something to do while her mind stayed elsewhere, hovering in a strange, distant calm. The desperation that had consumed her for months had dulled into something colder. Less frantic. More final. Ethan came home later than usual. She heard his car before she saw him, the familiar sound tightening her chest out of habit. When the door opened, the smell of alcohol drifted in with him. He kicked off his shoes without looking at her, dropping his keys on the counter with unnecessary force. "Did you eat?" he asked, already opening the refrigerator. "No," Lena said. "Figures," he muttered. She watched him from the kitchen doorway. He moved through the space with careless entitlement, as if the house still belonged to him alone. As if her presence were incidental. Ethan poured himself a drink and leaned against the counter, scrolling through his phone. The silence between them stretched, thick and uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that carried history, months of resentment, humiliation, and emotional neglect pressed into a single moment. "Mark invited us out tomorrow," Ethan said suddenly. "Or, well, me." Lena said nothing. "You don't have to come," he added, not bothering to hide the relief in his voice. "Probably better that way." Better for whom? She wondered. But she already knew the answer. He took a long sip of his drink and glanced at her for the first time that evening. His eyes lingered, assessing, critical. "You know," he said, his tone casual, almost bored, "people still ask about you." Her body tensed, but she kept her face neutral. She had learned the cost of reacting. "And?" she asked quietly. Ethan shrugged. "I tell them what I've always told them." The words landed softly, but the impact was devastating. Lena felt something inside her give way, not sharply, not painfully, but completely. There was no more room for hope, no space left for negotiation. "You enjoy this," she said before she could stop herself. Ethan frowned. "Enjoy what?" "Talking about me like that," she said. "Letting people laugh. Letting them think I'm disgusting." He scoffed. "You're being dramatic again." Dramatic. The word felt absurd in her mouth after everything she had endured. "I beg you to stop," Lena said. Her voice trembled, but she did not raise it. "I asked you." "I cried. I went to doctors. I tried everything." Ethan exhaled sharply, irritation flashing across his face. "I didn't ask you to do all that." "No," she said. "You just watched me do it." The room felt smaller, the air heavier. Ethan shifted his weight, clearly annoyed that the conversation had turned uncomfortable. "I can't pretend it doesn't bother me," he said. "What do you want from me? To lie?" "I wanted you to protect me," Lena replied. "I wanted you to be my husband." For a moment, something flickered in Ethan's expression, impatience, maybe guilt, but it disappeared just as quickly. "Everyone knows now," he said. "You should be used to it by this point." That sentence was the final blow. Lena felt a strange stillness settle over her. Her heart slowed. Her thoughts sharpened. The emotional chaos that had ruled her for so long simply stopped. She realized then that Ethan was never going to stop. There would be no apology, no awakening, no sudden understanding of the harm he had caused. This was who he was. This was what her life would continue to be if nothing changed. "I'm going to lie down," she said. Ethan waved a dismissive hand. "Do whatever you want." In the bedroom, Lena sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the wall. Her reflection in the mirror caught her attention, not because she was searching for flaws this time, but because she barely recognized the woman staring back at her. She looked hollow. Stripped of softness. older than her years. She lay back and closed her eyes, but sleep did not come. Instead, memories surfaced uninvited, moments from before the marriage, before the humiliation. Times when she laughed freely, spoke without hesitation, believed she was worthy of love. Tears slid silently down her temples, soaking into the pillow. She did not sob. She did not shake. The crying felt distant, automatic, as if it belonged to someone else. From the living room, she heard Ethan's laughter as he spoke to someone on the phone. She caught fragments of conversation, the tone light, mocking. She did not need to hear the words to know their shape. Something inside her hardened. She sat up slowly, her movements deliberate. There was no panic in her body now, no racing thoughts. Only clarity. A terrifying, unwavering clarity. This cannot continue. She thought about leaving again, about walking out into the night and never coming back. But she knew, deep down, that even if she escaped the house, she would never escape what Ethan had done to her. The shame had been planted too deeply. It followed her everywhere. The anger finally arrived, but it was not explosive. It was quiet. Focused. It did not scream. It whispered. Lena stood and walked into the hallway. The house felt eerily calm, suspended in time. Ethan's laughter had stopped. The television murmured softly in the background. She paused, her hand resting against the wall, grounding herself. Her breathing was steady. Her thoughts were precise. For months, she had felt powerless. Reduced. Erased. Tonight, that powerlessness dissolved into something dangerous, the certainty that she could not survive another day like this. When she entered the living room, Ethan barely looked up. "What now?" he asked, annoyed. Lena did not answer immediately. She stood there, studying him, his posture, his expression, the ease with which he dismissed her pain. For the first time in a long while, she saw him clearly, stripped of excuses and memories. "You destroyed me," she said. Ethan laughed once, sharply. "Oh, come on." That laugh echoed in her mind, merging with every insult, every public humiliation, every moment she had begged him to stop. Something irreversible settled into place. The night did not end in violence, not yet. But the path toward it had already been chosen. Lena felt it with a certainty that frightened her even as it steadied her. As the hours passed and the house felt quiet, Lena lay awake, staring into the darkness. Her body was heavy, her limbs numb, but her mind was painfully alert. This was the last night she would live like this. The last night she would be silent. The last night before everything changed. Morning was coming. And with it, consequences no one could undo. Morning arrived without ceremony. There was no thunder, no omen, no dramatic shift in the air. The house woke the same way it always did, quiet, tense, suspended in an uneasy calm that had become routine. But for Lena Whitmore, something fundamental had changed. The clarity that settled into her the night before had not faded with sleep. It had sharpened. She rose early, moving through the bedroom with deliberate care. Ethan was still asleep on the couch, one arm hanging loosely over the edge, his face slack with the dull exhaustion of alcohol. Lena watched him for a moment, not with anger, not with hatred, but with a strange, detached awareness. This was the man who had dismantled her piece by piece, not with fists, but with words. This was the man who had turned her private existence into a public humiliation. She turned away and went into the kitchen. The light through the window was pale and thin. Outside, the neighborhood stirred to life, cars pulling out of driveways, a dog barking in the distance, the ordinary sounds of people beginning their day. Inside the house, time felt slowed, as if it were waiting. Lena made coffee she did not drink. She sat at the table, her hands wrapped around the mug, staring at the surface until the steam dissipated. Her thoughts were steady now. There was no panic. No confusion. Only the overwhelming certainty that the life she had been living was no longer survivable. When Ethan woke, it was with irritation rather than surprise to see her sitting there. "You're up early," he said, rubbing his eyes. She did not respond. He shuffled into the kitchen, poured himself a glass of water, and drank it down quickly. His movements were careless, loud in the quiet space. He glanced at Lena and frowned. "What's with the staring?" he asked. "It's creepy." She met his gaze calmly. "We need to talk." Ethan groaned. "Not this again." "Yes," she said. "This." Something in her tone made him pause. He set the glass down harder than necessary and leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "Make it quick," he said. "I've got things to do." Lena stood. Her legs felt heavy, but she did not waver. "I can't live like this anymore," she said. "I can't be humiliated, dismissed, and erased every day of my life." Ethan rolled his eyes. "Here we go." "I beg you," she continued. "I asked you to stop." "You didn't. You laughed. You told people. You made me hate myself. You're blaming me for your issues now," he snapped. "That's not fair." "Fair." The word landed hollowly. "I'm asking you one last time," Lena said, her voice steady. "Stop." Ethan stared at her for a long moment. Then he laughed, short, sharp, dismissive. "Stop what?" he said. "Telling the truth?" That laugh echoed through her like a final verdict. Something inside Lena shifted, not explosively, not dramatically, but decisively. The clarity she had carried all night crystallized into action. The months of silence, the years of endurance, the endless attempts to make herself smaller, all of it collapsed into a single moment. Ethan's expression changed when he saw it in her eyes. "Hey," he said, his tone sharpening. "What are you doing?" Lena did not answer. The details that followed would later be reconstructed in fragments, through forensic evidence, through timelines, through the quiet testimonies of neighbors who heard nothing unusual. There was no prolonged struggle. No drawn-out confrontation. The violence, when it occurred, was sudden and irrevocable. When it was over, the house was silent again. Lena stood still, her breathing shallow, her body trembling as reality settled in. The man who had dominated her life, her thoughts, her sense of self, lay motionless. The finality of it pressed down on her, heavy and suffocating. She did not scream. She did not run. She lowered herself into a chair, staring at her hands as if they belonged to someone else. Her mind struggled to process what had just happened, not in flashes of horror, but in a numb, dissociated haze. Minutes passed. Or maybe it was seconds. Time had lost its meaning. Eventually, Lena reached for her phone. Her fingers shook as she dialed 911. When the dispatcher answered, Lena's voice was quiet but clear. "I need help," she said. "What's your emergency?" the dispatcher asked. "I killed my husband," Lena replied. "He's not breathing." There was a pause on the line. "Stay where you are," the dispatcher said calmly. "Help is on the way." Lena nodded, even though no one could see her. She set the phone down on the table and waited. As the sirens grew louder in the distance, a wave of emotion finally broke through the numbness, not relief, not triumph, but grief. Not just for Ethan, but for herself. For the life she had imagined. For the woman she used to be. For the countless moments when this could have ended differently if someone, anyone, had intervened. When the police arrived, Lena did not resist. She answered questions simply, honestly. She did not attempt to justify her actions, nor did she deny them. "I couldn't take it anymore," she said quietly. "I asked him to stop." The officers exchanged glances, their expressions professional but strained. They moved through the house, documenting the scene, preserving evidence, reconstructing a story that was already over. As Lena was led out of the house in handcuffs, the morning sun felt too bright, too ordinary. Neighbors watched from behind curtains and doorways, curiosity flickering across their faces. Lena kept her eyes forward. She did not feel like a monster. She did not feel like a hero. She felt empty. Behind her, the house stood silent, a place that had witnessed the slow destruction of a person long before the act that finally ended it. The murder would be remembered as the crime. But for Lena, the true ending had come much earlier. This was only the moment the damage became visible. The investigation began the moment the patrol cars arrived, their flashing lights cutting through the quiet suburban morning. What had been an ordinary street only hours earlier was now sealed off with yellow tape, the air thick with curiosity, disbelief, and unease. Inside the house, officers moved carefully, methodically, documenting a scene that appeared deceptively simple. There were no overturned tables. No shattered glass. No signs of a prolonged struggle. Detective Samuel Carter arrived shortly after the first responders. A veteran investigator with decades of homicide experience, he had learned to distrust scenes that looked clean. Violence, he knew, was not always loud. Sometimes it was precise. Sometimes it was the inevitable result of pressure that had built silently over time. Lena Whitmore sat at the kitchen table, hands cuffed loosely in front of her, her posture rigid but composed. She answered questions without hesitation. Her voice did not crack. Her eyes did not dart. She did not ask for a lawyer. She did not ask what would happen next. She simply told the truth. "I did it," she said when Carter introduced himself. "I'm not denying that." Carter studied her carefully. He had seen shock before. He had seen rage. What he saw in Lena was something different, exhaustion layered beneath restraint. "Why?" he asked gently. Lena paused, considering the question as if it were larger than a single answer. "Because I couldn't survive another day like that." Forensics began their work while the detectives separated fact from assumption. The medical examiner's preliminary findings aligned with what Lena had described. The timeline was clear. The absence of defensive wounds on Ethan Whitmore suggested no prolonged altercation. This was not a crime of sudden mutual violence. It was unilateral. Final. Yet something about the scene felt incomplete. Carter walked through the house slowly, absorbing its details. The meticulous cleanliness. The lack of personal warmth. The way the rooms felt hollow, stripped of intimacy. On the bedroom dresser, he noticed unopened mail addressed to Lena. On the bathroom counter, prescription bottles, none recent, all discontinued. He turned to one of the officers. "Pull their phone records," he said. "Text messages. Emails. Everything." The investigation widened quickly. Neighbors were interviewed first. Rachel Moore stood on her porch, arms crossed tightly against herself as she spoke. "She was fading," Rachel said quietly. "You could see it. She barely spoke anymore. She looked ashamed all the time." "And Ethan?" Carter asked. Rachel hesitated. "He talked. Too much. About her. About things that should have been private." The pattern continued with each interview. Friends described Ethan as blunt, unfiltered, often dismissive. More than one confirmed hearing him complain openly about his wife's body. About intimacy. About things that left listeners uncomfortable but unsure how to intervene. Mark Delaney sat stiffly in the interrogation room, his jaw clenched. "He vented," Mark said. "I didn't think. I mean, people say things. I didn't think it was that bad." "Did Lena ever say anything to you?" Carter asked. Mark shook his head. "No. She barely spoke to anyone anymore." Digital evidence filled in the gaps. Lena never spoke aloud. Text messages showed Ethan making jokes, dismissive remarks, sarcastic comments about his marriage. None of them were explicitly threatening. None of them crossed legal lines on their own. But together, they painted a picture of sustained degradation. Psychological abuse does not leave bruises. But it leaves patterns. Carter reviewed Lena's medical records next. Multiple doctor visits. All normal results. Notes indicating anxiety, distress, self-doubt. No history of violence. No prior arrests. No evidence of instability before the marriage. This was not a woman with a criminal past. This was a woman who had endured. During a follow-up interview, Carter asked Lena to walk him through the months leading up to the killing. She spoke slowly, carefully, as if choosing her words with precision. "I didn't plan to kill him," she said. "I planned to make it stop. I just didn't know how anymore." "Did you consider leaving?" Carter asked. "Yes," Lena replied. "More than once." "Why didn't you?" She looked down at her hands. "Because he made me believe I was the problem. That no matter where I went, I would still be this." Carter wrote that sentence down verbatim. As the investigation progressed, the narrative shifted from a simple domestic homicide to something more complex. Prosecutors began reviewing the case with caution. The evidence supported Lena's confession, but it also revealed a prolonged pattern of emotional harm that could not be ignored. Assistant District Attorney Olivia Grant joined the case early, requesting full access to the investigative files. She knew how juries reacted to cases like this, how quickly sympathy could blur into controversy. "This isn't self-defense," she said during a strategy meeting. "But it's not cold-blooded either." The challenge was clear. The law recognized physical threats more easily than psychological ones. There were no restraining orders. No police reports filed before the murder. Nothing on paper to justify lethal force in the traditional sense. And yet, the damage was undeniable. Detective Carter returned to the house one last time before it was released. Standing alone in the living room, he imagined the months that had passed within these walls, the quiet erosion, the unspoken despair. He had seen violence born from jealousy, greed, rage. This was different. This was violence born from being unheard. When Lena was formally charged, she showed no visible reaction. The weight of the words, second-degree murder, settled over her like a familiar heaviness. Consequences were expected. Almost welcomed. At her arraignment, she stood silently as the charges were read. She did not cry. She did not argue. Her eyes remained forward, fixed on a point beyond the courtroom walls. Outside, the media began shaping their own version of events. Headlines questioned motive. Commentators debated responsibility. Some painted Lena as a victim pushed too far. Others labeled her actions unforgivable, regardless of circumstance. Inside the investigation files, however, a quieter truth existed, one built not on speculation, but on evidence. A truth that showed how words, repeated often enough, could dismantle a person just as thoroughly as physical force. Detective Carter closed his notebook at the end of his final report. "This case," he wrote, "is not about a single morning. It's about everything that came before it." The investigation was complete. The facts were laid bare. Now, the story would move to a courtroom, where those facts would be tested, argued, and judged, not just by the law, but by the conscience of everyone who heard them. By the time the investigation concluded, the question no longer centered on what Lena Whitmore had done. That much was clear. The harder question, the one that unsettled detectives, attorneys, and later the public, was how a woman with no history of violence, no criminal record, and no apparent instability could reach a point where killing her husband felt like the only remaining option. To answer that, the court turned to psychology. Dr. Helen Brooks, a forensic psychologist with decades of experience evaluating defendants in violent crimes, was assigned to conduct a comprehensive assessment of Lena. She reviewed thousands of pages of material, police reports, medical records, interview transcripts, witness statements, and Lena's own words. What emerged was not the profile of a predator, but the anatomy of a collapse. Dr. Brooks met Lena in a quiet evaluation room at the detention facility. From the beginning, Lena was cooperative, articulate, and emotionally restrained. She did not dramatize her suffering. She did not minimize her actions. She spoke plainly. "I know what I did," Lena said. I'm not trying to escape that. What struck Dr. Brooks immediately was Lena's effect, not flat, but muted. There was no volatility. No signs of psychosis or delusion. Lena understood reality. She understood consequences. She understood morality. And yet, she had crossed a line she herself could not reconcile. This contradiction became the core of the psychological analysis. Dr. Brooks identified a prolonged pattern of emotional and psychological abuse, specifically, chronic humiliation and identity erosion. Unlike episodic verbal conflict, this form of abuse operates cumulatively. It does not shock the system, it dismantles it slowly. Humiliation, Dr. Brooks later explained, is not just an insult. When repeated by a trusted partner, it becomes a redefinition of self. In Lena's case, Ethan's behavior followed a consistent pattern: repeated public degradation, dismissal of Lena's emotional distress, refusal to stop after being explicitly asked, framing the abuse as truth rather than cruelty. Over time, this created what Dr. Brooks described as learned helplessness compounded by identity collapse. Lena stopped seeing herself as a person with agency and began seeing herself as an object defined by her husband's narrative. This was evident in Lena's medical history. Multiple doctor visits showed no physical pathology, yet her distress intensified. Each normal test result reinforced the idea that the problem was not something that could be fixed. That realization, rather than bringing relief, deepened her despair. She internalized the abuse, Dr. Brooks noted. She began policing herself more harshly than anyone else. The psychological term for this phenomenon is introjection, when an external voice of criticism becomes internalized as one's own inner dialogue. In Lena's mind, Ethan's words no longer needed to be spoken aloud. They were already there. By the time Lena withdrew socially and left her job, she was exhibiting classic symptoms of severe psychological entrapment: social isolation, emotional numbing, dissociation, loss of future-oriented thinking. Most notably, Lena demonstrated cognitive narrowing. Under extreme, prolonged stress, the brain begins to eliminate perceived options. What once felt possible, leaving, seeking help, starting over, gradually disappears from mental reach. By the end, Dr. Brooks testified, Lena did not experience her situation as something that could change. She experienced it as something that could only end. This distinction was critical. The killing itself, according to Dr. Brooks, did not stem from rage in the traditional sense. There was no explosive anger, no impulsive frenzy. Instead, Lena described a state of emotional detachment on the morning of the murder, a hallmark of dissociation. When the mind can no longer tolerate pain, Dr. Brooks explained, it sometimes shuts down emotion to preserve function. That state can feel calm, clear, even purposeful. This did not excuse Lena's actions, but it explained their psychological origin. Importantly, Dr. Brooks found no evidence that Lena derived satisfaction, relief, or empowerment from the act itself. Immediately afterward, Lena displayed profound grief, not just for Ethan, but for her own life, her lost identity, and the irreversible consequences of what she had done. She didn't feel free, Dr. Brooks said. She felt finished. The analysis also addressed a common misconception that enduring emotional abuse does not equate to danger because it lacks physical force. Dr. Brooks rejected this outright. Psychological abuse changes brain function, she stated. It alters perception, decision-making, and stress response. Over time, it can become as incapacitating as physical captivity. The court heard testimony about cumulative trauma, the effect of repeated, unaddressed emotional injury. Unlike a single traumatic event, cumulative trauma wears down resilience gradually, often invisibly. Lena's final breaking point, Dr. Brooks concluded, was not the argument on the morning of the murder. It was the culmination of months, possibly years, of being stripped of dignity, agency, and self-worth by the person she trusted most. She did not kill because she wanted to, Dr. Brooks said. She killed because, psychologically, she could no longer imagine surviving. This conclusion did not absolve Lena of responsibility. But it reframed the narrative. The act was not born from cruelty or malice. It was born from collapse. As the psychological analysis ended, the courtroom sat in uneasy silence. The evidence had revealed something uncomfortable, that violence does not always come from monstrous intent. Sometimes, it comes from prolonged neglect of suffering that society struggles to recognize. The mind, like the body, has limits. And when those limits are crossed, the results can be catastrophic. With the psychological picture now complete, the case moved forward, not just as a legal battle, but as a moral reckoning. The next stage would force a jury to confront an impossible question. Where does accountability end, and where does responsibility truly begin? The courtroom was silent as Lena Whitmore was led to the defense table on the first day of trial. The quiet was not empty, it was heavy, charged with expectation and unease. Reporters filled the back rows. Members of the public sat shoulder to shoulder, drawn by a case that refused to fit neatly into familiar categories. This was not a trial fueled by mystery. Everyone knew what Lena had done. What no one could agree on was how to judge it. Lena sat still, hands folded, her posture composed but restrained. She did not look toward the gallery. She did not look at the prosecution. Her gaze remained forward, fixed on a point just beyond the judge's bench, as if anchoring herself to something solid. Assistant District Attorney Olivia Grant rose first for opening statements. Her voice was calm, measured, and deliberate, trained to command attention without theatrics. This case, she began, is about a line that cannot be crossed. She acknowledged the emotional weight surrounding the trial but warned the jury against allowing sympathy to cloud the law. No matter the circumstances, no matter the pain, the defendant made a choice. She ended a human life. Our system does not permit private citizens to decide when another person deserves to die. Grant laid out the facts with precision. The absence of immediate physical threat. The lack of defensive wounds. The defendant's own admission. She emphasized that Lena had options, leaving, seeking help, involving authorities, but chose none of them. This was not self-defense, Grant concluded. This was homicide. When Thomas Reed, Lena's defense attorney, stood to speak, his approach was markedly different. He did not raise his voice. He did not dramatize. He spoke slowly, deliberately, as if inviting the jury to lean in. This case, he said, is not about excusing violence. It's about understanding how it happens. Reed asked the jury to consider the full context of Lena's life, not just the final moment. For months, maybe years, Lena Whitmore lived under a constant assault on her identity, he said. Not bruises. Not broken bones. But something just as destructive, relentless humiliation. He paused, letting the words settle. Words can imprison a person. And when the mind becomes a prison, escape begins to feel impossible. The prosecution called its witnesses first. Police officers testified to the scene, the evidence, the timeline. Their accounts were factual, detached, and efficient. The medical examiner confirmed the cause of death. No new revelations emerged, but the weight of finality grew heavier with each confirmation. Then came the witnesses who complicated the narrative. Rachel Moore took the stand, her voice soft but steady. She described watching Lena disappear over time, how she avoided eye contact, how her posture collapsed inward, how her presence seemed to shrink. She looked ashamed, Rachel said. Like she thought she didn't deserve to take up space. When asked about Ethan, Rachel hesitated. He talked about her, she said. In ways that made people uncomfortable. But no one stopped him. Mark Delaney followed. His discomfort was evident. He shifted in his seat, his answers clipped. I thought he was just venting, Mark said. I didn't think it was abuse. Reed leaned forward. But you heard him repeatedly degrade his wife? Yes. And you never intervened? Mark swallowed. No. The courtroom grew still. The defense then called Dr. Helen Brooks. Her testimony was clinical but devastating. She explained, in clear language, how prolonged psychological abuse affects cognition, decision-making, and perception of escape. She did not excuse Lena's actions. She contextualized them. By the time of the incident, Dr. Brooks stated, Lena's psychological state was one of extreme constriction. She did not perceive alternatives in the way a healthy individual would. Grant cross-examined sharply. Dr. Brooks, she said, are you saying the defendant didn't know what she was doing? No, Dr. Brooks replied. I'm saying she knew what she was doing, but not because she wanted to. Because she believed, incorrectly but sincerely, that she had no other way to survive. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. Then came the moment many had anticipated, Lena's testimony. She walked to the stand slowly, deliberately. She was sworn in. She sat. For a moment, she said nothing. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but unwavering. I love my husband, she began. I tried to make the marriage work. I tried to change myself. I tried to disappear. None of it was enough. She described the humiliation, not dramatically, not emotionally, but plainly. How Ethan spoke about her. How people began to look at her differently. How she began to see herself through his words. I stopped feeling human, she said. I felt like a problem that needed to be managed. Grant pressed her hard on cross-examination. You could have left, she said. I tried, Lena replied. But you didn't. No. You didn't call the police. No. You didn't file for divorce. No. Grant's voice sharpened. So instead, you killed him. Lena held her gaze. I asked him to stop. I begged him. I couldn't survive another day. The courtroom was silent. In closing arguments, the prosecution returned to the law. This case cannot be decided by emotion, Grant said. If suffering becomes justification for killing, then the rule of law collapses. The defense followed with a quieter appeal. Justice is not blindness, Reed said. It is the ability to see the whole truth, even when that truth is uncomfortable. The jury deliberated for hours. When they returned, the room seemed to hold its breath. The verdict was read slowly. Lena did not react immediately. Only when the words fully settled did she close her eyes, not in relief, not in despair, but in acceptance. She was not found innocent. But she was not judged without context. The sentence reflected that tension between accountability and understanding, between law and humanity. As Lena was led from the courtroom, the public reaction fractured. Some saw a murderer who had crossed an unforgivable line. Others saw a woman abandoned by a system that failed to recognize psychological violence until it was too late. The trial had ended. But the question it raised would linger far beyond the walls of that courtroom. When does endurance become destruction? And how many warning signs must be ignored before silence turns fatal? The courtroom remained silent as the judge prepared to deliver the sentence. The verdict had already been read, but this moment carried a different weight. Guilt had been established. Responsibility acknowledged. What remained was consequence, and the meaning that would be assigned to everything that had happened. Lena Whitmore stood as the judge addressed her. She listened without interruption, her expression composed, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. The words were formal, restrained, and deliberate, but beneath them lay an acknowledgement that this case did not fit neatly into the language of punishment alone. The sentence reflected that tension. Lena was not given the maximum penalty. The court cited the absence of prior violence, the documented psychological harm, and the expert testimony that described her mental state at the time of the crime. At the same time, the judge was unequivocal: a life had been taken, and the law demanded accountability. As the sentence was read, Lena did not cry. She did not speak. She simply nodded once, as if confirming something she had already accepted long ago. When she was led out of the courtroom, the reactions around her were divided. Some faces showed anger. Others showed quiet sympathy. A few looked away entirely, unwilling or unable to reconcile what they had just witnessed. Outside, the media moved quickly. Headlines appeared within hours, framing the story in conflicting ways. Some called it a tragedy of unchecked emotional abuse. Others reduced it to a simple act of murder, stripping away the context that had filled the courtroom for weeks. Public debate followed swiftly and fiercely. On talk shows and online forums, people argued over responsibility. Could humiliation truly destroy someone to this extent? Should psychological abuse carry the same moral weight as physical violence? Where should the law draw the line between explanation and excuse? There were no unanimous answers. In prison, Lena's days settled into a rigid routine. The structure was harsh but predictable. For the first time in years, her environment was quiet, not tense, not unpredictable. The absence of Ethan's voice was disorienting. So was the absence of constant fear. In counseling sessions, Lena spoke sparingly. When she did not focus on the act itself. She spoke about erosion. About how slowly her sense of self had vanished. About how silence had become easier than speaking, until silence became unbearable. "I didn't want freedom," she said once. "I just wanted the pain to stop." Those words stayed with her counselor long after the session ended. Rachel Moore attended the sentencing but never spoke to reporters. Later, she would say only this: "I wish I had said something sooner." It was not a confession. It was a realization, one shared by many who had watched the case unfold. Mark Delaney stopped returning calls from journalists. He replayed his conversations with Ethan in his mind, recognizing now what he had failed to recognize then. Venting. Joking. Truth. All words that had once felt harmless. They no longer did. Detective Samuel Carter closed the case file weeks later, but it lingered with him longer than most. He had seen violence born of rage, jealousy, and greed. This case had been different. It had forced him to confront the limits of what law enforcement could see, and what it often missed. "You can't arrest words," he said to a colleague. "Not until they turn into something else." Years later, Lena would be eligible for parole. Whether she would be granted it remained uncertain. But even behind bars, her story continued to resonate far beyond her own life. Advocacy groups cited the case in discussions about emotional abuse. Mental health professionals referenced it when explaining cumulative trauma. Couples therapy programs used it as a warning, not about violence, but about neglect, cruelty, and the dangerous power of unchecked words. Lena did not see herself as a symbol. She did not seek understanding or forgiveness from the public. She lived with what she had done, carrying the weight quietly, deliberately. She understood that nothing could undo the past. Not remorse. Not explanation. Not punishment. But if her story forced even one person to recognize suffering that did not leave bruises, if it made one voice speak sooner instead of staying silent, then something meaningful might emerge from the devastation. The case of Lena Whitmore was never just about a murder. It was about what happens when humiliation becomes routine. When pain is dismissed as weakness. When silence is mistaken for resilience. The verdict closed the legal chapter. But the aftermath continued, in conversations, in caution, in the uneasy awareness that some wounds are invisible until it is too late. And in that awareness, the story truly ended, not with closure, but with a warning that still echoes long after the courtroom lights dimmed.